Hi, I'm Emma Walton Hamilton, and I'm a children's book author and an editor and an arts educator. And with my mother, Julie Andrews Edwards, I've authored such children's books as the Dumpy the Dump Truck series, Dragon, Hound of Honor, The Great American Mousical, Simeon's Gift, and Thanks to You, Wisdom from Mother and Child. Recently, I wrote a book called Raising Bookworms, Getting Kids Reading for Pleasure and Empowerment. And my mother and I will soon be coming out with a poetry anthology called the Julie Andrews Collection of Poems, Songs, and Lullabies. I started out as a theater performer and a director and a producer, and then became an arts educator from there. And then from there moved into writing myself, so that when I began writing, I was also teaching playwriting to young people in the classroom. And I would find that I would rush home from class and say, I know what's wrong with this scene. It's missing its conflict, or the theme isn't strong enough in this piece, or whatever it is. And so it really, my work as an artist and as an arts advocate and an arts educator really informed and continues to inform my writing. Now, of course, as an editor, that's taken it one step further, because I have the privilege of helping other writers shape their work, which in turn always makes me think about what needs to be continued to be developed in my own and in my teaching, dovetails back and helps me, I think, better serve my students as well. So it becomes wildly synergistic all the way around. I think writing and reading are completely synergistic. Not necessarily in that one has to be a good reader to be a good writer, or vice versa, but that they so inform each other. I mean, reading obviously so enriches our vocabulary, broadens our perspective, gives us ideas, awakens our mind and our compassion and our awareness and so forth, all of which I think informs our writing for those of us who are writers. But also, I think I personally, as a writer, read differently, knowing how tough it is to write, knowing how challenging it is to articulate and to express clearly and economically and with focus and with purpose. I become so much more of an admirer and a fan of other people's writing when it really works and sings. I think that children who read are better writers, and children who tell stories appreciate books, and reading and hearing stories. Those two things are completely intertwined. And in fact, statistically, we know that children who do read and read well, and read as a preferred activity, which is different from just know how to read, are much more likely to be better writers, be more successful academically at school, and also engage in other creative pursuits, such as participate in the performing arts, attend cultural events later in life. That reading has a direct impact on the degree to which children, and then the adults they grow into, become engaged citizens. I've been teaching young writers in both middle school and high school for about 15 years, and just recently have been invited to create a program called the Young American Writers Project for Stony Brook Southampton's. Their MFA in Writing and Literature program is sponsoring this wonderful writing program, which will go out and is in fact already going out into area middle schools and high schools to bring professional writers into the classrooms to work with students on, at the moment we're doing playwriting, but by the end of the year, we will be including screenwriting and poetry and personal essay and fiction. And it's a wonderful and exciting program. Right now, we're launching it with playwriting, which is what I've been doing in my previous incarnation as running the education programs at Bay Street Theater, which I was a co-founder of. I ran a program there called the Young Playwrights Program. And so that is a piece I know well, and we were able to translate for this particular new program, the Young American Writers Project. So we're starting with the playwriting, and then we'll branch out from there. And by the end of this, each semester, what we do is we push into the classrooms for 7 weeks, twice a week, in teams of 2 teaching artists per classroom. And we essentially take the students through the basic concepts of dramatic writing, introduce them to ideas like character and conflict and theme and dialogue construction and so forth. And by the end of the semester, every student has written his or her own short play. And then at that point, the focus shifts away from writing and more towards production. And one play is selected from each school by a selection committee, and we then produce the plays. And the students act in them, and we hire professional directors, and we actually create a real professional performance from these plays. And it's the most exhilarating, wonderful program to be a part of and to teach, because I have the great good fortune to see how it impacts these young people's lives. And over the years, I have to say, I have seen kids make the decision to attend college who, at the beginning, before the program began, didn't think that was an option for them. I've seen students decide they were going to be writers. I've seen students decide they would become journalists, performers, directors. One student started an actual newspaper, a local newspaper adjunct to our existing local newspaper, and went on to become a political correspondent. And so it's just such a gift to work with these young people and see what writing and the arts brought together can do for young minds. Playwriting is particularly good for developing critical thinking skills because there's a great deal of problem solving involved in crafting a play and in thinking creatively about the imperatives of theater. Theater is a collaborative medium. It's not a solitary medium such as perhaps writing fiction is, or painting, or some other artistic disciplines. Theater really depends upon the actor's feedback once the play is up and on its feet and being staged and produced, the director's conceptual approach in tying all the elements together, the designer's contributions. All of that comes together to create this whole that doesn't exist without each piece contributing to it. And as a result, the playwright has to think creatively about all of those elements. The playwright has to think, I need to convey, a car chase here, but this is theater. How do I solve that problem, given the confines of theater and the fact that, this isn't a movie and this isn't a novel? I can't just write whatever I want. I have to think about the limitations. And it forces a kind of problem solving and a kind of creativity within the confines of the structure that one has to work within that I think is unique to playwriting and to theater. I think the collaborative nature of theater serves to strengthen writing skills considerably because it forces the writer to think multidimensionally. You have to ask questions about the material that you don't necessarily have to ask if you're writing just straight fiction. You have to figure out, will a designer be able to, you don't have to solve the problem for the designer, but you have to be able to open your mind to the question of what challenges will this pose for a scenic designer, for a lighting designer, for a sound designer, for a production designer. Those kinds of questions the writer has to be wrestling with while they're writing. There's also the element of suspension of disbelief that is unique to theater. When you go into a film, when you go and see a movie, for example, everything is pretty much fed to you, spoon-fed to you. It's all there on the screen, and the student who's watching a film is just, receiving in a sense, not necessarily being asked to actively participate, other than to receive and to listen and to absorb and integrate the story. With theater, you have to, by nature, walk into the space and say, I surrender my disbelief. I am willing to sit here in the dark with these people to the right and to the left of me and believe that that one wall that is the backdrop of the set is actually extending all the way around, and this is a real room where this scene is unfolding, or in fact, we're not indoors, we're outdoors, or we're in space, or wherever we may be, and that sound effect is in fact a helicopter or whatever it might be. There is a real level of participation with the imagination that an audience member is required to do in the theater, and I think the writer writing for theater needs to always keep that in mind, needs to write with the audience in mind and the audience's journey in mind. in a way that is different than other writing disciplines. Whether you're telling a story, you know, orally or on the page or on the stage, you're still dealing with a beginning and a middle and an end. You're still overcoming a conflict of some sort or solving problems. You're still exploring relationships and ideas and themes and messages and so forth. So they are completely related to each other. I like to think of them as wonderful complements to each other. One of the things that excites me and my mother and I when we write together is thinking creatively about how each of those disciplines can support each other with a particular idea. So for example, can this book be adapted for the stage, and might there then be another opportunity for a young person to experience the ideas in this book or in this story from a different perspective? We had this experience recently with one of our books, Simeon's Gift, which is a picture book that we wrote together. And it happens to be a book about music, or about a musician, a minstrel who goes on a journey in search of his craft and his muse in order to win the love of his lady and with, I should say, the approval of her father. The love isn't a problem, it's whether they are allowed to be married. And we had the extraordinary experience of adapting that original story and book into a play for the stage, and then a musical, I should say, with songs that were inspired by the story and by the characters and so forth. And then taking that one step further, we were asked to develop the piece for symphony. And so those songs and that score were then extended that much further for 82-piece orchestra, and we developed it for symphony. And at the same time, we also explored creating a web game around the journey that this young musician takes in the book, where children can go online and make their own mini symphonies from the sounds of nature, which is essentially what Simeon does in the story. So all of these pieces were wonderfully synergistic with the book itself, and our fantasy and our dream was that, you know, the young person who read the book might then come to the theater or to the symphony and have different senses and different ideas awakened, and then go back to the book with that new perspective and new awareness, and then perhaps log on and experiment with creating their own symphony online, and that there would be a real sort of multi-dimensional, multi-creative experience that starts with the book and ends with the book, but goes all over the place in between. I wrote the book Raising Bookworms because I was finding that whenever I went on public speaking appearances, author tours, book signings, into classrooms, into libraries, what I was hearing the most often, the single most consistently asked question that both my mother and I would often, when we travel together and appear together, were hearing, was, how do I get my child reading again? How do I get my child reading to begin with, or how do I get my child reading again? He or she used to be a wonderful reader, but I've lost them to the internet, or I've lost them to the Game Boy, or whatever it may be. And how do I get my kid to turn off the Game Boy and pick up a book? And we were hearing this question with such frequency and urgency that I began to think, boy, this is really becoming a serious issue in our society and in our community. And of course, as a parent, I could relate, because I have two kids. I have a son who is 12 and a daughter who's 5, and certainly the digital world is a big part of our life. And I'm fortunate in that both my kids love to read and are terrific readers, but I didn't want one thing to replace the other. I wanted that to continue, that joy of reading in our life. And I thought, let me see if my experience as an author and as particularly an arts educator, if I can do some research and see if I can address this question in a way that may be more accessible to parents and to people who are short of ideas as to how to bring that back to life. To me, the single most important element in raising bookworms, in raising a bookworm or several bookworms, is keeping the joy alive in reading. This is the whole focus of the book. It's the whole premise of the book, and if we ask ourselves only one question as parents in relationship to this idea, I think it should be, am I serving the joy with this activity, or am I serving something else? Am I killing the joy? And it's an interesting dilemma, because children, when they're babies and they're toddlers, we tend to read to them much more. I hope in an ideal situation, when we're babies and toddlers, we are read to, we are snuggling and cuddling and being loved with our family members. Maybe we have a snack, or we're nursing, or we have a bottle, and reading is equated with all things wonderful and warm and fuzzy. Reading equals love. And then we go to school and we begin to learn to read for ourselves, and sometimes it's a struggle. Often it's a hard thing to do, to learn how to read. And there's a certain amount of pressure and expectation from teachers and perhaps from parents as well. And maybe the material isn't as scintillating as the favorite story at home that's being read to us by our beloved family members. And little by little, we begin to associate reading with pressure and with responsibility and with chore and with duty and with frustration or with boredom. And around that same time that this is happening, what we tend to do as parents is back off of reading to our kids so much, thinking I need to promote, independent reading skills, and I need to let the child go and do their own reading rather than reading to them. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. This is the time when we need to read more to keep the joy alive. Because if we back off of reading and all they're doing is experiencing the frustrations of learning to read and the pressures of learning to read, then reading is no longer associated with joy. It's now associated with struggle and chore. And so the book's premise is, let's bring back the joy. Let's look for ways, and I call them stealth mode activities, because I think kids have a wonderful way of knowing when we have an ulterior motive, and just because they think it's an ulterior motive, pushing back against it. So I think one of the challenges for us as parents is to be a little bit subtle about our approach and crafty, and find stealth mode techniques to keep the joy alive. So for example, with the youngest readers, it's as simple as making sure that the reading environment is inviting, making sure that the lighting is good to read by, making sure that it's cozy, that there aren't too many distractions of sound or visual distractions. Having the TV on in the other room can be very distracting to a child who's reading or being read to. The basic environmental support, creating a reading nook, a place to go and read together, and establishing reading rituals and those kinds of things for younger children are very important. Reading everywhere and anywhere, whenever possible. I'm a great believer in reading at the dinner table, reading in the bath, reading in the car, reading when you're waiting in line, For older children, it starts with keeping books available everywhere. In the kitchen, in the living room, in the bathroom is a great reading place. In the car, just having reading material available, surrounding kids with books as much as possible. Regular trips to bookstores and to libraries are hugely important in terms of exposing kids to the tactile pleasures of books and reading and all the opportunities that they provide. And then looking for these wonderful creative opportunities to build on reading experiences. So if a child is reading The Little Engine That Could, for example, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory if it's an older child, or Harry Potter, looking for perhaps a train exhibit to take them to, or train music, or train art, or going to see the Harry Potter films, or exploring other books by Roald Dahl, or other books in the same genre, or cooking a recipe from a book together, or creating a crafts project that might be inspired out of a story or a particular experience in a book. Those kinds of activities are just wonderful ways to play and keep the spirit of joy alive around the reading experience. It's also very important, I think, to demonstrate for kids how reading contributes to life skills. things like reading recipes together, reading manuals as we build things together, models or household products that need to be assembled or whatever it may be, reading ingredients when we're shopping on the backs of boxes. Those are all wonderful ways to support reading skills without pressure, in a way that is showing a child how important reading is to our lives, and that makes them feel involved and included and gives them a good sense of the degree to which reading skills play a role. Taking our kids with us to vote, those kinds of little activities send powerful messages to our kids about the value of reading in our lives, and the need to have that as a part of our life skill base. Thanks to You, Wisdom from Mother and Child is a mother-daughter tribute. Actually, it's a parent-child tribute. It's not specific to women or to daughters or mothers. We were invited by our publishers to write something for Mother's Day that celebrated the parental-child bond, but particularly that came from our perspective as a mother-daughter writing team. And so we wrestled with thinking, what could we say that would be, new or original or different, and what could we bring to the discussion? And they wanted it to be very simple and very sort of accessible to young readers, and also perhaps something that could be gifted to mothers and to grandmothers and so forth. And we hit upon the idea of how much we've learned not only from our parents, but from our children, both of us. So how much we've learned from each other as mother and daughter, and then how much I've learned from my children, and how much my mother has learned from her grandchildren and learned from her mother, and how this cycle continues. And we thought, wouldn't it be nice to see if we could convey through a story how we learn from each other and our gratitude for the lessons that we've learned from each other. So in a very simple form, Thanks to You is really a series of statements of gratitude for the lessons learned from our mothers and from our children, and for the love shared and for the bond created as a result that can never be broken, even in spite of distance and growing up and having one's own life. I get asked a lot about, what about reluctant readers? A lot of parents are concerned that, but my kid is a reluctant reader. He just, no matter my best efforts, what can I do? And I think there are many ways to help reluctant readers, to bring them along to reading and to rediscovering the joy of reading. It only takes one book to hook them in. It only takes one really successful, thrilling, joyful, wonderful, losing oneself in the magic reading experience to captivate that child's imagination, and then, if we're smart, to take that moment and that opportunity and parlay it into other wonderful reading experiences. So it's not about a relentless journey. It's about finding that one thing that will help that reluctant reader spark their imagination and be the portal into opening their curiosity to other reading experiences. There are some very practical ways that we can encourage reluctant readers. Anything from reasoning with them, quite simply saying, look, I understand this is something that you feel that you're not particularly interested in at this time. This is hugely important to us. This is a value we hold as a family. Let's just, for 1 week, let me read you this story. And if at the end of the week you're miserable and you don't want to read it anymore, that's fine. I've done my part. Chances are, if you pick the story right by the end of 1 week, the child will be begging for more. That's one way. Another way is to suggest to use, a little bit of incentive. You can stay awake a little bit longer. You can, as long as you're reading in bed, you can stay up until such and such a time tonight. Using reading as a motivation. Giving books as gifts is a great way to associate reading with receiving a gift and love and pleasure for any age reader. Bringing a reluctant reader oftentimes resists the read aloud experience because they think they're too old for it or they've outgrown it or what have you. bringing in altruism, asking them to perhaps read to a younger sibling, or read in a Big Brother, Big Sister program, read if they're babysitters or their mother's helpers or so forth to their younger charges, can be a great way to get them involved in a story without their realizing that they're actually becoming involved, thinking that they're doing it for other reasons. I think we have to be very careful not to use reading as a weapon, or as something that we hold over their heads. For example, we have to be very careful not to say, if you don't stop that behavior, no bedtime story tonight. If you don't do such and such, no reading tonight. That then is creating a negative association with reading. That's then building the connection between reading and pressure, or reading and punishment, or reading and something negative. And though it might seem like a logical consequence, there are plenty of other logical consequences I think we can choose that aren't potentially eroding that connection between reading and joy for a young person, which it's so important to keep feeding and nurturing and to keep alive. There are a number of different ways to read that aren't just limited to books on paper. My son, for instance, is an avid lover of audiobooks. There's a bit of an argument about whether audiobooks is really reading. I say, absolutely, it's really reading. You are absorbing story and idea and character and all the things that reading entails, just because you aren't actually doing it with your eyes. One wouldn't say reading Braille isn't really reading. So why is reading audiobooks not, why is that any different? Audiobooks can be a wonderful tool for a reluctant reader. For my son, he has some vision issues. Reading is fatiguing for him. Audiobooks are a wonderful solution for him. Audiobooks are also a terrific way for the older child to experience the value of read aloud without necessarily feeling like they're being read to by their parent or what have you. All of the additional support in terms of comprehension and absorbing the story and meaning and nuance are all being gained subtly in that stealth mode I was talking about before, by hearing the story told to them by somebody who is modeling, tone and wonderful reading skills and so forth, in a way that the child might not necessarily be able to do in reading it for themselves. The other important piece is that we know that until about 8th grade, our listening skills and our reading skills haven't converged. So it's terribly important to keep reading to older kids, because we can still absorb much more from hearing a story than we can from decoding it ourselves on the paper. And so audiobooks are a wonderful way to continue to help kids do that, and they will always gain so much more from hearing it or being told the story or listening to the story than from fighting through reading it themselves. There are a lot of people out there who think, well, that's just comic books, or what do you think of comic books is another question I get. And my view is, whatever captures a child's imagination and gets them interested in reading is fine by me, because the chances are, if they are engaged by that story, that will lead them to be curious about more stories. And there, again, just as there are kids who have vision issues who respond to the value of an audiobook, there are also kids who have, attention span issues, or who have tracking issues, or who have oral issues, who really respond to the visual imagery of pictures and the stories that you can tell through pictures. And so for them, a graphic novel might be a wonderful solution, or even comic books might be a wonderful solution as a way of working up to more complicated storytelling. So there are many, many ways to come at helping a reluctant reader from different angles, but always ideally without them feeling like they're being pressured to do so. This is a purely personal thing that I have to say, and I know that there are probably many people out there who disagree with me, so full disclosure up front, but I have a real question about the problem novel in today's, it's very fashionable in today's children's literature market to write for kids books that are very dark, deal with extremely difficult, complex, complicated issues like death and addictions and body issues and all sorts of things. I am absolutely not suggesting we not present kids with complicated material, or that we not invite them to stretch up to stuff that they're ready to cope with, or that if a child needs that kind of support for an issue that they're wrestling with, that isn't valuable. But there are kids out there for whom the relentless onslaught of darkness in contemporary children's literature is turning them off of reading. And I see this a lot in the kids that I teach in the schools right now, is that their reading assignments, what is currently being assigned on the reading lists and the curriculum, through the curriculum in the schools, are these sort of oftentimes tied in with the curriculum of whatever the grade level is. You know, these books about sacrifice or about war or about death or about loss, and one after another can really erode a child's joy in reading. And I think we have to really know our kids. That's, to me, that's the key. You know, what works for one child and really sparks their imagination and makes them feel, I'm not alone, someone understands, somebody's life is worse than mine, whatever it may be, may not work for another child. And maybe that other child needs fantasy or needs humor or needs, you know, a little bit of levity in their life. And I worry about the degree to which the problem novel is being sort of touted as the future of children's literature, because I think there are so many kids out there. And I will say, you know, in the interest of full disclosure, my son is one of them. My son is a very sensitive boy who finds it very tough to read books in which, you know, parents die, children die, you know, miseries are abounding all over the place. He finds it really tough going. And really what he would like to do is read stories that inspire, stories that engage his imagination, stories that make him laugh, characters that make him laugh, and stories that teach him something or make him think or make him learn. So he gravitates towards memoir and nonfiction and so forth. But when for school he has to read these, you know, books about Mayan sacrifice or whatever it may be, he has a really tough time with it. And to his credit, he actually once spoke up to his English teacher and said, I'm really finding that the reading material that we're being given is turning me off of reading. And fortunately, she had the presence of mind to say, okay, your next read can be a free read. And he was able to choose his next book as a result of speaking up and saying, I'm having such trouble with this relentless stream of negativity. And then, of course, it became all about, what's the free read going to be? You know, you've got one chance to pick something that's going to really be a joy to experience. And so, you know, we had to help him with that and finding the right one. My advice for parents in helping kids select material is to know, first and foremost, know your child. You know, we all know that if we have more than one child, we know how individual each child is. If we were part of a family with more than one child, we know how unique we are from our siblings. What one book worked for this child won't necessarily work for that child. What one book we may have loved as children won't necessarily work for our kids. It's about knowing our children and helping to fuel and to feed their individual passions. And then there are ways that we can, there are clues from our kids as to how we can support that. For example, what posters are on your kids' walls in their bedrooms? Who are his or her heroes? What are his hobbies? What does she most love to do in her spare time? Those activities, those heroes are clues to what they're drawn to. My son is a baseball fan and a musician, and you know, he loves baseball memoir. He also loves books about science and nature and so forth. My daughter is all fantasy, and if I were to give her, you know, a science story or you know, a sports story, she would be bored to tears. But give her something with princesses and fairies, she asks for more. So it's really about knowing our kids. It's interesting. every year Scholastic does a wonderful survey, Kids and Family Reading Report, in which they assess the sort of the reading climate. And one of the things that came out of the most recent report is that something like 82 or 85% of kids say one of the reasons they don't read more is they have trouble finding books they like. And I think we assume, particularly with older kids, that they know how to choose books for themselves. You know, that a child should be able to go into a library or a bookstore and find something that interests them based on its cover or based on what they might read on the jacket flap. But that's not necessarily true. I think kids really need support and guidance in finding out what books work for them and what authors inspire them and what styles and what genres they respond to. And a case in point is when my sons had this free read experience, that he was given the chance in school to have this free read, and he was so relieved, you know, to be able to choose something he wanted. He then was paralyzed with, you know, what do I choose? There's anything, the whole world of books is now available to me, which one? And I could see that he was struggling, so I said, well, tell me, what would you ideally like it to be? I mean, throw out some adjectives or some ideas or some words so that I can get a sense. What kind of book are you thinking you'd like it to be? And he said, well, I'd like it to be funny. I said, okay. He said, and I'd like it to be real, like, you know, realistic. It doesn't have to be nonfiction, but it'd be nice if it were sort of realish, memoirish. And I'd like it to have something to do with nature. And so then I had to put my thinking cap on and help him figure out something that had all of those components, and we settled on Gerald Durrell's My Family and Other Animals because it's funny and it's a memoir and it's full of stories about animals, and it was just the right choice for him. It was wonderful. But by himself, I don't think he ever would have come to that choice or that decision. Now, it doesn't have, we, the parents, don't have to be the person to do that. There are librarians, there are teachers, there are wonderful resources of people out there to help us find those perfect books for our kids if we can understand what they respond to. If we see that our child loves ballet, we can ask the librarian, do you have any great books about ballet, you know, stories about ballet, backstage ballet stories? Or if we know that our child loves baseball, you know, do you have any great baseball memoirs? And we can ask the librarian to ask our child pointed questions, leading questions to help figure out what might turn them on as well. So there are a number of ways that we can help lead kids to books they love. I think the task is that we have to remember that they need us to do that, and, you know, that we can't expect them to just know, you know, what they love right off the bat. Well, I have the great good fortune of writing much of what I write with my mother. My co-author is my mother, and in fact, we've written together now 17 books, and with several more in the pipeline. And it's interesting. When we first started writing together, we weren't sure how it would work. We weren't sure if we would be compatible writing together. We're both fairly opinionated, bossy women, and fairly strong women, I should say, is a better word. And we thought we might clash a little bit. We weren't sure. The happy discovery has been that we seem to have very complementary strengths, and we are very good at knowing when to defer to one another. Mom tends to be very much more of the kind of big ideas, big picture, visual person. I tend to be more about the structure and the details. And so those strengths are greatly complementary. The process is quite wonderful. And it's become much easier as years have gone by. When we first started writing together, it was a little bit more labored. We felt we always had to be in the same room together, and we would do everything longhand on yellow legal pads with pencils and endless cups of tea and so forth. Now we've actually started incorporating technology quite a bit into our work, and we do, since we live in separate states, we actually live on separate coasts most of the time. We do most of our work together via webcam. The webcam has revolutionized how we work together, because the fact that we can actually see each other as well as hear each other means that we are able to work with a kind of shorthand that somehow the phone didn't provide. And so there's a great deal of sign language that, you know, it's more like this than like that, you know, there's a great deal of body language that comes into play. She's in her home office on Los Angeles, and I'm in mine in Sag Harbor, and we agree to log on at a certain time, and we get to work. It's very funny because the first time we did it, the first time we started working on the webcam, she said, Mom said she put on perfume before before logging on, and then suddenly realized what a ridiculous thing it was that she had just done. You know, oh, I must just put on some perfume before I get to work with them. You know, yeah, because it's not, you know, we haven't come that far yet with our technology. But the process is essentially what we do is once we have a sense of the idea of what we'd like to try to write about. For example, if we use The Great American Massacre as an example, we knew we wanted to tell a story about theater mice and in which the theater would be in jeopardy and the mice would save the day. Once we have our outline that we're working from, then it literally becomes a process of finishing each other's sentences. And at that point we go very organic, and one of us will just jump in and start free associating, and the other one will say, that's so close, but it's not quite the right word. It's more of a blue word or a red word, or, you know, and it becomes this incredible sort of very fluid give and take process of writing and finishing each other's sentences. And meanwhile, I'm typing furiously. And once we've transcribed whatever we've done for the day, then there's a great deal that goes on in the editing process, and it's back and forth, and, you know, changing this word and that word and tightening, you know, sentences and realizing what's missing and so forth. And so a huge amount of our work is done in the aftermath of the writing. But it's become a very organic process, and both of us feel now that when we try to write alone, we miss each other. And it's funny because people, solitary writers, you know, solo writers, often say, how do you write with a writing partner? I can't imagine, you know, writing with someone else. And we're at the point now where it's sort of like, how do you write by yourself? How do you write without that person to bounce ideas off of, without that sounding board, without that give and take of ideas? And so we've become very attached to writing together, and hopefully we'll continue to do it for a long time. The other thing I should add is that one of the wonderful discoveries, a lot of times people will say to me, you know, I can't imagine writing with my mother. What is that like, you know? Or with my daughter, what is that like? And the happy surprise for both of us is that it has actually strengthened our relationship. And I think it's because before we were working together and writing together, time spent together or you know, phone calls and so forth were often weighted with news of the day, you know, discussions about family issues, politics, health concerns, you know, problems, whatever they may be, the normal things that one discusses and deals with and grapples with in families. Now, a huge portion of our time, in fact, most of our time together, because we don't have a great deal of time together, so we have to work very concentrated, is creative. And we're in this wonderful world of children's literature where, you know, where it's all interesting characters and, you know, fun ideas, and it's like being in a sandbox and playing, you know, when we get together now. It just feels like we get together and play and throw ideas around and have a great time instead of talking about arthritis or some of the other things that might come up in a conversation with one's parent or one's child, adult child. I think it's really important when we talk about and think about kids and reading that we not limit ourselves to thinking about just fiction. You know, we tend to think of children's books and then immediately make the leap to fiction and, you know, picture book and novel and so forth. In fact, depending on the child, nonfiction can sometimes be much more engaging for an individual than even fiction might be. It also doesn't need to be a huge tome. It doesn't need to be a biography or memoir or what have you. I mean, nonfiction can encompass, you know, reading the paper, reading magazines. A wonderful thing to do for kids is to give them subscriptions to magazines of particular areas of interest. And there are magazines on every subject imaginable. I mean, everything from, you know, bead collecting to baseball, to horses, to fashion, to you know, quilting. I mean, they're just endless subjects, and it's a great way, if you know that your child responds to a particular activity, a great way to marry that activity with reading and with literacy is to give them a subscription to a like-minded magazine or journal or newspaper or literary publication. My view is that, again, it's whether a child reads nonfiction or fiction, there's no ideal, there's no prescription that says you should read this much fiction and this much nonfiction, or you should read, you know, this many books per year on this subject or on that subject. It's all about the individual and whether we are speaking to that individual's passion and building upon the opportunity that creates. In other words, finding out what makes sparks the imagination, what makes the heart sing, what makes the appetite for reading come alive, and then looking for ways to support that. And that might be nonfiction, it might be fiction, it might be newspapers, it might be magazines, it might be audiobooks, it might be graphic novels, it might be comic books, it might be reading online, it might, you know, there are any number of possible ways to engage the imagination and the mind with reading, as long as we keep the focus on the joy.